Well, greetings to you. I'd like to talk to you today about, if you will, the world situation, if that doesn't sound too grand or difficult a task. We are beginning to hear one or two references, as it were, to the global situation today, as it appeared in July 1914. And as many of my subscribers know, I'm a military historian, and my area of expertise in particular is the Great War, on which I have lectured at many a university and many a military academy. Of course, not everybody agrees with me. No historians always agree. And of course, it's always very difficult to put a modern template on an aspect of history, as A.J.P. Taylor, who was my mentor of the Magdalen College School, would say. So we need to draw what we can from history, which does repeat itself, but only in mutated form. We have a tendency not to learn anything from history, and one of the problems that we have, especially in the modern day, we have politicians who have not had the benefit of a traditional education. Now, I'm not suggesting they didn't go to Oxford and read PPP and whatever it's called and have a bloody good time, get rat-arsed, so on and so forth. But they didn't really learn very much and they don't know very much, which means that our current Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, actually on television, American television, couldn't hold an intelligent discussion about Magna Carta or the principles of English law. That's how bad they are. And he was Prime Minister. He's now Foreign Secretary. He's now in the House of Lords. As always, of course, nobody elects these people. He's just sort of turned up again. But leaving that aside, our own politicians in Britain are pretty hopeless. In America, in Washington, they're even worse. Not only have they never read a history book, I don't believe they can actually read. And of course, as we all know, and I've been to over 35 American states over my career, and I've never once read a newspaper in any state which mentioned any news that was outside the state. So you have these problems. Excuse me. Anyway, let's have a look at July 1914. What do we have? Well, we have a number of players on the stage. There's been an arms race from round about 1902 to 1913, certainly between Great Britain and Germany. And it was, of course, a naval race, arms race, ships, dreadnoughts, battleships. As every schoolboy of my generation knows, I don't expect anybody's taught about this kind of thing today. So there was a bit of a race, an arms race, if you will. And there were a number of flashpoints geopolitically. There was the Balkans, there was trouble in the Balkans, as there always is trouble in the Balkans, one might argue. Also, social unrest. There'd been a number of assassinations, there'd been unrest, strikes, socialism, trade unionism, all these things were coming to the fore towards the autumn, as it were, of the Industrial Revolution. And these things were fairly global. The United States was a growing economic power, not a military power, but a growing economic power. Russia was a growing power as well, of course, in the Tsarist Russia, with their natural resources, so on and so forth. And Germany was, of course, basically Prussian-led. The Federation of Germany, Federal Germany, was Prussian-led, which is very militaristic in the late 1890s, very militaristic. And of course, they'd just come out of, relatively recently, in 1870, the Franco-Russian War, which we had the good sense to not involve ourselves. So it was a very awkward time geopolitically. There were many a tinderbox and many a match, as it were. Now, there were some similarities to the problems that we have now. Serbia had a big brother. It had a big mate in Tsarist Russia who felt that they had to look out for the Serbs because they were fellow Slavs. And in that case, they felt obliged to look after the Serbs and take the Serb cause. We had the Prussian-led German Federation. And they were bound with hoops of steel to the fading Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was fairly rickety and militarily not very strong. Although they had plenty of soldiers, it wasn't very strong, it wasn't very well organised, and a dodgy economy, so on and so forth, who were permanent loggerheads with Italy, geopolitical loggerheads with Italy as well. So it was very awkward and difficult. We signed an Entente Cordiale in the early 1900s, largely brokered by King Edward VII, in point of fact, because we were getting worried about German militarism, and we felt that we needed a friend, however fair weather they may be, as France, of course, always is. And France were allied to Russia. They had an alliance, a military alliance. And this is something that the Germans didn't really like. But we had an Entente Cordiale, and that was really so that we wouldn't clash on matters of empire and colonies. And we sort of said, right, okay, the French can have North Africa and we'll have Middle and East Africa and South Africa, so on and so forth. There were some German colonies, German Southwest Africa, for example, and one or two others. But Germany wasn't a colonial power. Certainly not in the way that the French and the British were. It wasn't a colonial power, although they wanted to be so. They wanted to be a colonial power, which is why the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, a very unbalanced individual incidentally, wanted to expand his fleet. Now, we needed a big fleet in order to look after our empire. So it was, if you will, regardless of your view of empire, it was a legitimate reason for a big fleet. And because we weren't a land power, because we were an island, we didn't really need an army. And bear in mind, those days, the French army was counted in millions, the German army counted in millions, and if you include reservists, and Russia likewise. So there were very big armies, but we didn't need those because we weren't a land power. So you have all these situations in play. And of course, what kicked it off, as we all know, was the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand by a Serb, Gabriel Princip, in point of fact. And Austria-Hungary were actually clamouring to crush Serbia. They wanted to crush Serbia, and they were perfectly determined to do that. And of course, that threatened war with Russia. A war with Russia, of course, with its vast landmass and almost limitless supply of personnel, was a difficult opponent, as indeed it was in the 1940s and the Second War and so on and so forth. It was a very difficult adversary, as it was to Napoleon, and proved to be so for Hitler later on. So Germany felt that they had to bear up the crumbling Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Britain had an Entente Cordiale, and some politicians felt there was a moral obligation to go into the war on behalf of France when Germany invaded France through Belgium. Bear in mind another thing that isn't often remembered. We had no military alliance at all with France. It wasn't a military alliance, it was an entente based on colonies. We also had no treaty obligation to protect neutrality of Belgium. It was a tripartite treaty. And when the Germans invaded Belgium, it became null and void. And if you look at the Hansard in 1914, July 1914, no politicians or lawyers, nobody was making the case that we had an obligation to defend Belgian neutrality by treaty. There was a feeling that there could be a moral obligation, but this is all past history. And so when Russia mobilized in fear of the Austro-Hungarians in order to defend Serbia, then Germany mobilized, and France mobilized, and then we mobilized our Royal Navy just a few days later. And then we had on our hands a world war. At that stage, it was broadly speaking a European war, but of course it turned into a world war. And now, as we all know, with all the casualties and the heartache and the bloodshed and the loss of treasure that involved. No good came of it for anybody. None of the belligerents got a result out of the Great War. And indeed, there was another war, which I would regard as part of the same war, back in 1939. So it all kicked off again. And I've said this many a time, nobody ever really wins a war. Wars are bad things. Wars are bad things. They're expensive and they cost a lot of blood and treasure. So they're no damn good at all, wars. Now, what have we got now? If you look at the globe now, we have some similarities. As I say, history repeats itself in a mutated form. We now have Israel, which is a client state of the United States, in much the same way Serbia felt its way to be the same relationship with Tsarist Russia. So there's a problem there. We also have in America, and the United States of America, a militaristic neocon situation in Washington, which really just reflects what was going on in Berlin under von Bülow and the expansion of the German Navy under von Tirpitz and so on and so forth. So we have this militaristic situation both in Washington now as it was in Berlin then, stirring the pot, as militarism always does. We also have expansion, land expansion, areas of influence expansion, which is what Germany wanted in their colonies. They wanted to expand their colonies. And they thought if they had a successful war, perhaps with France, they could absorb all those colonies in Africa and so on and so forth. So very often these things are about money and land and resources. It's no different today. It's no different today. Part of the neocons in Washington want regime change in Moscow. That's going well, isn't it? And of course, the BlackRock and the banks, JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, they want to get their hands on the resources of the Ukraine. And over the past of the global post-war Cold War, they wanted to get their hands on the Soviet Union collapse of the resources in the Russian Federation after the Soviet Union collapsed. So it's always about banks and money and expansion. And of course, that expansion is NATO, a NATO expansion in much the same way that Israel wants to expand on the West Bank and the Gaza Peninsula. So it's all about expansion and money. I'm not taking one view or the other. I'm not pro this or anti that. It doesn't make any difference. I'm just telling you how it is and how it has been for hundreds of years. So we are in that situation now. And we don't need much flashes to the tinderbox. We don't need much flashes to the tinderbox for this. If you fill the Red Sea or the Eastern Mediterranean or the Western Ukraine with soldiers, guns, weapons, and all the rest of it, you are risking an escalated war. You're risking a very big war with the difference, of course, that they didn't have in 1914-18, nuclear weapons, which, if you will, are the final say, the Gotterdammerung, if you will, of war, possible modern warfare. So the situation is extremely dangerous we have at the moment. And I also don't believe that even the nutcase neocons in Washington want a regional war in the Middle East, which could get out of hand. They've got enough on their hands with a proxy war in the Ukraine, which is not going well and should be open, I think, around about September would be my guess, when the Russian flag is flown over both Odessa and Kiev, but we'll have to wait and see. But of course, what happens if an American aircraft carrier in the Eastern Mediterranean or the Red Sea, or a British one, come to that, gets sunk by relatively inexpensive modern drones or undersea drones, so on and so forth, which is quite possible, Glug, 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 it goes to the bottom. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Where do you take it from there? And of course, we have a particularly bellicose political establishment in the West. And we also have a very bellicose press, which take their lead from Washington, the Washington neocons. So your op-ed in the Daily Telegraph is written almost verbatim by the CIA in Washington. And it beats the drum. And we saw the same thing, to go back to 1914-18. We saw the Northcliffe Press, did we not? banging the drum, nasty Germany, bayoneting babies in Belgium, à Berlin in Paris, and of course the German press have been stoking up anti-English feeling for some time, for some years. Well, indeed, it's in point of fact since after the Boer War. So you can't, in the modern world, go to war really without your population coming with you on this. So you keep our press and our television, the CNN, CNBC, BBC, keep everybody in the dark, and they keep on banging the drum that Putin's a really bad man and everything's terrible and the Russians are all terrible and the Soviet Union hasn't really disappeared and he's got designs on invading Eastern Europe and Central Europe, all of which, of course, is a complete and utter nonsense. But you'd be amazed how many people believe it. Down the pub, they've read the Daily Express and they're all wound up after a few beers. This is how wars start. And everybody goes and joins up and it's all, bang, gung-ho. Jingoism, we called it just before the Crimean War. So everybody's psyched up. And the French now are talking about sending a few brigades to Odessa, which, of course, the Russian Federation regard as within their domain or potentially going to be within their domain. It won't make any difference because a few French brigades are laughably small compared with the big picture which is going on when you think the Russians have something like 150 brigades. Britain could probably field one logistically supplied brigade. So all this is saber-rattling rhetoric, which is laughable, which is drummed up by our politicians and our newspaper op-eds. But the people we put in there wouldn't last 5 minutes. But what happens if you do put them in there and they're captured? Where do you go from there? So this whole thing could get out of control, sort of a bit like the Great War, sort of by accident. He did this, they did that, they reacted to this, and they reacted to something else. And there's a complete and total failure of diplomacy, as there was in 1914. We're not talking. We're not getting round the table. We have refused to talk to the Russian Federation. We're just not talking. Diplomacy can avoid war, good diplomacy. And of course, as Clausewitz said, that warfare is just diplomacy by extension, by another means. But we seem to have lost the art of diplomacy. It's all foghorn diplomacy by these people in power in both London, Paris and Washington, who again, I say, have not had the benefit of a traditional education. And of course would not be called upon to go into the front line. It's already well banging the drum, is it not? You can bang the drum for war if you're not the one that's going to have to go and wear a tin hat and gun and get your head shot off. And it was ever thus. It was ever thus. Old men sending young men to war. No good will come of it. So I give you these points because I'm hearing it quite a lot, the allusion to 1914 into 2024. And a lot of it is actually true. So we need to step back from the abyss and increase diplomacy. Let's get on with some diplomacy, shall we? Before it's too late. As most of you know, my work is very heavily independently research-based. And I get my information from all over the world. It would help if you press the subscribe button and the little bell next to it, because the more subscribers I have, the more likely it is that international independent research institutes will share their material with me. It's most helpful, and then of course I automatically share it with you. So, surprise, won't cost you anything. Thank you very much.